Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kate Bond, the Director of Labor Market Policy and Interim Chief Economist at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Thank you for joining us today for our event, Beyond Place-Based, Reducing Regional Economic Inequality with Place-Conscious Policies. Today, we're highlighting an essay on regional economic inequality by University of Michigan sociologist Robert Manduca that is part of our series, Ideas to Boost Wages in the New Economy. The series, which was developed in partnership with the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment at UC Berkeley, and with generous funding from the Bernard and Ann Spitzer Charitable Trust, includes 10 essays featuring cutting-edge voices in economics who bring their research to bear on some of today's most pressing policy challenges, increasing wages and reducing income inequality so that a post-pandemic recovery is resilient and broadly shared. Today's event will begin with a fireside chat between Robert Manduca and American University Associate Professor of Public Affairs Bradley Hardy. Following their chat, we'll have a panel discussion with Olugbenga Ajilore, Senior Advisor at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Dominique Derbigny, Senior Vice President at the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, and Whitney Tucker, Deputy Director of Research on the State Fiscal Policy Team at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, which will be moderated by my colleague, Catherine Zekier, Labor Market Policy Analyst at Equitable Growth. After the discussion, we'll have a Q&A with the audience. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping notes. All questions on the event's content go in the Q&A box, and technical and logistic questions go in the chat box. In the Q&A box, when asking questions for the panelists, please give your first and last name, along with your institution and workplace, and if the question is for a specific person, please indicate to whom your question is directed. The event is on the record and is being recorded. I would now like to turn to Robert Manduca and Bradley Hardy. Welcome, Robert and Bradley.
Hey, thanks, Kate. And, this is mainly about learning more from Robert and his exciting work, So frankly, there's like not enough time to really go as deep as I'd like to go. But I'll tell you, Robert, I've been really excited to discuss your work. You do a great job of sort of identifying a range of regional outcomes and policies that vary quite a bit in ways that many folks might not realize. I think one of the main points you make is that we got to understand regional economic inequality as a problem with broader national level implications. I think people oftentimes think about, that region has a specific set of economic issues, but they don't really necessarily affect other regions. But they have national level consequences, but they also might have some federal national level solutions. So I was just hoping you could tell us a bit more about your work on place-conscious policy, what that means, and also just kind of the regional inequality trends that you've been concerned about, the ones that you're really focused on.
Yeah. Thanks, Bradley, and thanks, Kate, for having me here. I'm really excited to talk about this research. In this essay, I'm talking about regional inequality. So this is looking at inequality between different parts of the country. So I'm mostly focused at the level of metropolitan areas. So, why are average incomes in San Francisco larger today than average incomes in Cleveland or in the Rio Grande Valley or in other parts of the country? And so this is, distinct from inequality within regions of, why is a certain neighborhood or a certain group of people earning more than their neighbors and then the other people they live near. And it's more about this question of, why are average incomes for an entire metro area or entire part of the country lagging or exceeding those of other areas. And so that's something that this regional inequality has grown a lot over the past few decades. So, it's always been true that some parts of the country are richer on average than others, but as late as the 1970s, the average incomes of most regions were sort of roughly in line with the national average. So the statistic that I look at is, in 1980, only about 10% of the population of the U.S. lived in a metro area that had a mean income that was either 20% greater or 20% lower than the national average. And by 2013, that proportion had risen to about 30%. So today, 3 in 10 people live in places that are substantially richer or substantially poorer than the country as a whole. So we've seen this bifurcation. And so, as you noted, I think to some extent, historically, certainly the first reaction to this has been sort of like, well, that's really unfortunate for the people who live in those particular regions, but is this something that the federal government should be concerned about or should be getting involved in? And I really think that it is. So for a couple of different reasons. So on the one hand, it I think is increasingly clear that regional economic challenges contribute to larger social difficulties or social problems. So we see this in, things like looking at different public health crises. So, the COVID pandemic certainly, but also preceding that, things like the opioid epidemic and, the work that Ann Kaysen and Angus Deaton have done on deaths of despair and tying that to local economic conditions. So this is sort of something that's contributing to broader social problems.
Sure.
And I also think it contributes to political sort of dysfunction or polarization. There's been, as the conditions in different places become increasingly distinct from one another, the sense that we're all sort of in the same boat or, living in the same economy can tend to dissipate. And there's been some research that suggests that places experiencing economic dislocation also sort of experience more political polarization or the rise of more extreme political views that make it harder to compromise and make policy decisions.
Well, it's interesting. There's a map in one of your studies that I found fascinating, which it kind of made the point, and maybe you can speak to this, that oftentimes when we think about regional inequality, and even my own work thinks a lot about state level differences, but actually that masks what I think, to your point, is this interesting within state differentials. So it's sort of like, yes, that's one piece of this, but kind of to your point, there's a metro area aspect to this that perhaps people haven't really thinking about within North Carolina, within Georgia, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and this is one of the challenges for policymakers, right? Is that in terms of the economy or in terms of economic productivity or economic activity, oftentimes the unit of analysis or the unit at which that takes place is generally the metro area, which is sort of a city and the suburbs that it draws commuters from. And those don't map onto either to local governments or to state governments. And so, you have situations like, New York State, which has New York City on one end and Buffalo on the other, and those are in really different economic circumstances. And then conversely, you have places, again, like New York City or Washington, D.C., where the metro area is split up across different states, and that makes policy action really hard as well.
No, well, and it's an interesting thing. One of the things you start talking about is that, look, there's all these sort of place-based policies. In some respects, my co-author Marcus Casey and I have thought hard about the idea that, state EITCs can operate as a type of place-based policy in some respects. But you kind of make a point that there are potentially place-conscious interventions that maybe differ a little bit. And I think it'd be interesting to kind of make the distinction and talk a bit about what you see as solutions. I think one of the really cool things is that you lay out a set of solutions where we could maybe reduce these disparities.
Yeah. So I think historically there's been a lot of, and actually right now there is actually a lot of interest in reducing regional inequality, and much of that has come in through the form of place-based policies, which are essentially sort of spatially targeted either investments or subsidies that are sort of where policymakers identify either a neighborhood or a region that is lagging economically or could use additional investment and target that for subsidies. And I think those definitely can have a role to play. But the types of policies that I'm sort of more focused on in this essay, and that I think are potentially maybe more transformational, are what I call place-conscious policies. And so that's basically the idea here, is to recognize that, essentially every type of government policy, every type of federal policy has some sort of spatial footprint, right? Depending on the conditions in a given metro area or a given place, a particular change in policy will have a greater or lesser impact on a locality. So I think we should recognize that and be thinking about these geographic questions throughout our federal policy making.
Okay.
And that there are things that the federal government can do that don't have an explicitly geographic, that don't say sort of geography in the title, or don't have an explicit spatial targeting component, that can nonetheless contribute to reducing geographic inequality between regions. And so, in this essay, I give sort of 4 examples that I touch on 4 examples. So, one of these is universal anti-poverty programs. So these are things like perhaps the EITC or the recently expanded child tax credit, or even just Social Security in general, where eligibility isn't typically tied to where you happen to live, but because the people who receive the programs, are disproportionately spread across the country and tend to concentrate in more disadvantaged areas, these universal or non-spatial programs will have the effect of reducing disparities between regions. So that's sort of one example of a place-conscious policy. So it's not place-based because it's not tied to place, but it still would have the effect of reducing inequality between places.
Oh, it's interesting. I mean, and to that end, I mean, do you see the potential for some of these interventions to, say, intervene on behalf of racial inequality to improve that? I mean, I can imagine that being, to your point, a potential, positive consequence of this.
Mm-hmm. Totally, yeah. So I think there are very interesting interactions between racial and regional economic inequality, and a lot of these stem to some extent from the fact that different racial and ethnic groups are differently distributed across the country, right? So certain groups are disproportionately living in certain areas, and so that means that the economic conditions in those areas will have a disproportionate impact on the groups that happen to live there. So here I'm cribbing to some extent from your work, but you've documented how African Americans are disproportionately live in parts of the South and the Midwest that may have experienced sort of greater economic dislocations, either historically in the case of the South or more recently in the case of the Midwest, and so that will have the effect likely of increasing racial inequality simply through the mechanism of these national level shifts in where economic activity is happening. And so, I think that means that we, as we work to reduce regional inequality, some of these policies will also have the effect of will create the opportunity, I guess I would say, for reducing racial inequality. Though you have to also be attentive to conditions in a particular place as well for that to be realized.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting feature of the work, right? I mean, so there's folks like Zach Parolin. I know some of my work with Jordan Davis and Rucha Samudra, where we really document this link between, the share of Blacks on the welfare caseload and the propensity of the state to provide, cash assistance within their welfare program. And that's very much a regional story that then has a racial piece to it. And, there have been folks, I want to say there was work out of the Hamilton Project and, Hillary Hoynes and Marion Bittler, who kind of documented a similar pattern. And so that was just a sort of a very narrow policy analysis thinking about TANF, but it comes to mind that you have these state level policy choices, intended or not, that have these inequality implications. And depending on who lives where, then this is shaking out, say, in the case of many Black residents to potentially have a weaker social safety net, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is definitely a piece of it. And there's also sort of not only the safety net component, but also more broadly public investments, right? So I think there's been work, I'm thinking of like Alora de Renencourt on investment in local public goods and how that decreased in places that were recipients of large numbers of, for after the Great Migration. And so, that contributes to racial inequality within those places in the moment, but it also is quite likely, I think, undermining the economic future of those places because they're not investing in things like education or infrastructure that will.
See, this is actually a really interesting point you make, and I'm glad you brought this up because when a lot of folks think about fiscal federalism, I think part of what they're envisioning is they sort of stop at the part where they'd say, oh, well, you have this sort of redistribution broadly where, more prosperous states and residents and businesses pay into a federal tax system that ostensibly redistributes to less well-off, less economically prosperous states. And, I think that part of your point is that, yes, that may be true, but it's more complex. And there's some other aspects of this fiscal federalism relationship that people are missing that potentially exacerbate inequality. I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about that. You just started to, so yeah.
No, I think this is one area, and this is sort of one of the policy areas along with these universal transfer programs that I think is really has a lot of potential to reduce regional inequality. And so, the way that we do fiscal federalism is sort of unusual in the United States compared to other countries. And, we do have some national programs, especially like Medicare and Medicaid, that are federally funded, but go out based on to some extent on income or based on age and that sort of thing. So those programs, I think, are sort of maybe examples of sort of fiscal federalism that can work where you do have this redistributive effect. Though, of course, in the case of Medicaid, we've seen that not all states take up the expansion, right? And so that doesn't necessarily reach its goal. But then I think that in the another aspect of fiscal federalism where I think the U.S. is sort of where it's more problematic is the way that that state and local governments raise revenue, right? So currently there's not a lot of support direct transfers from the federal government to local governments in particular, and also to state. Like, they exist, but they're lower than they used to be, and they're lower than they are in most other places. And so that I think both is sort of a national level problem, and then also is definitely something that exacerbates regional inequalities. So what that means is that since local governments in particular have to raise so much of their revenue locally, that means that you get this this system of tax competition where there's sort of a race to the bottom effect of places competing to try to attract businesses or residents with low tax rates, and that means that they can't provide government services, and that also has the effect of advantaging already prosperous regions, right? Because if you are already fairly wealthy, then you can provide the same level of services or a higher level of services with a lower tax rate because your economic base is greater. And so it has this, it contributes to the further widening of these gaps. And then at the same time, I think we've seen recently how this can be a major problem in terms of national level economic performance, particularly around macroeconomic shocks, right? So, because so many of these governments have to generate their revenue locally, and because they're prevented from running deficits, that means that when you see a downturn, suddenly you have all these layoffs of government employees or potential layoffs, and and that of course only contributes to the macroeconomic downturn. And so this is sort of something that I think is both at a national level is exacerbating recessions and causing problems, but then also is contributing to inequality between places.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting though. You do make this point that it has been, over time, over decades, a national level, federal level retreat in the aggregate in terms of federal spending to state and locals. And, I think a lot of folks in the education space have talked about this retreat in the context of funding for higher education, and how, many state governments then are relying on out-of-state tuition. It's still relatively affordable, but far less so. And so this kind of represents sort of a relative decommitment. But, we've talked about it in the very highly stylized, salient higher ed example, but no, this is happening on a state and local level too. It's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, it reminds me, and again, not putting a values statement on it per se, but you also speak to this sorting issue, essentially, that you have this challenge of potentially prosperous counties or cities where if you have a very prosperous tax base, very affluent households, then you can have a lower tax rate, for example. But this can really create challenges for neighboring jurisdictions. I mean, one of the things I've thought about is that, people don't tend to think about kind of externality effects. So if you're underfunding public services, public safety, education in a neighboring jurisdiction, I just don't think people can really wall themselves off, right? Those challenges and consequences will come across what are artificial borders, right? So,
yeah, no, I think that's 100% right. It's like I think people have this illusion, or I think it's mostly an illusion, that you can sort of withdraw and sort of, keep your resources within your boundaries, and that you'll sort of, separate yourself from everything else that's going on. But I think that really, that's not something that really will last, and it's not something that should be encouraged. Certainly.
No, that's right. That's right. And I mean, I guess, one thing that I'm thinking about now, and again, I think like maybe this is a decent parallel or maybe not, but, there is a theme that reminds me here of kind of universal policy that can have disproportionate benefits for particular groups. And here it's sort of universal policy that could have very disproportionate benefits. This might help, Alabama relatively more than North Carolina even, right? So, I mean, do you think that's a reasonable comparison or not so much?
No, 100%. And I think, I draw inspiration from this work on like targeting within universalism, this sort of approach that I think of as like Theda Skocpol or John Powell. And, they were talking mostly more about demographic or other types of groups, but I think it applies equally to spatial groups or spatial units. And I think that's exactly the right, I personally think that's a very effective way to approach things, both in terms of just like pure policy efficacy of like, it's really hard to target, to consciously choose like exactly which places need exactly how much investment. And so if you can have a universal policy that's based, either totally universal or based on some national level threshold or cutoff or have a scale, then that will sort of automatically, without your conscious effort, will automatically target itself sort of better than you possibly could on your own. And I think it's also sort of useful in terms of like maintaining political coalitions of, not having sort of identifying particular places as being sort of in need or distressed or, it just makes it, everybody has the same eligibility, everybody's in the same program, and we'll let the program itself do the targeting.
Yeah, I mean, in our spaces, I think that there's this tendency to really enjoy thinking about states and even local jurisdictions as these laboratories of democracy. Let's see how Memphis runs an anti-poverty program over here, or if Wisconsin does interesting things on welfare waivers, right before welfare reform, which was a long time ago now, right? But nonetheless, I think that the other side of this then is that there can be a federal role potentially to say, look, there is a threshold, there is a floor, at which we want these particular policies to be implemented, even if the states are still doing the administration, that we maybe even learn from seeing the variation across states and cities and how these things are administered. So, I could imagine it being both the resource level, right? So I think there's a resource story, pumping in more resources, but then thinking about, in some respects, and, the degree to which states do and don't have autonomy over certain choices. I know, for example, there's been quite a bit of discussion about whether and to what degree states should be able to opt out of, the more generous pandemic UI, right? And so, there's labor supply concerns, but I think another aspect of this is to say, well, the labor supply issues are very complex. This is a national level priority. And, if you just happen to live in the wrong state, then you're not receiving this more generous benefit. And that, there can be a national level priority to say, look, this is a policy we care about. This is a particular standard we want to set nationwide,
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think, there's this idea of like having sort of a national, some levels of national sort of consensus on like, there are certain things that come with residing in the United States, no matter where in this country you reside, and there's going to be a floor on that, I think is important. And I think it's also important to, on the one hand, there is a lot of value to the sort of experimentation and learning from variation, that sort of thing at the state and local level. But it's important to understand sort of, we talked about this a bit with the fiscal question, the extent to which certain levels of government really are constrained, particularly in an open economy where, capital and labor are free to leave at any given point. That really does put constraints on what a locality can do that don't operate at the federal level. And so we need to recognize that, I think.
The last thing I want to talk about here, because there's going to be a great panel that'll feature, among other things, discussions about sort of metro and sort of more rural economic conditions and the tension there. I think one piece that you speak to that my work has spoken to, perhaps in more of an intergenerational mobility context, but you speak specifically about policies that concentrate market power and how this actually relates in important ways to regional economic inequality. And I think, oftentimes folks have front of mind, kind of direct spending, but maybe they're not thinking as much about kind of antitrust policy, for example. And I wonder if it's just in the remaining minutes we have, and again, your work's great. We don't necessarily have enough time, but I wonder if you could just speak to that.
Yeah. So no, I think that's sort of one area that where there's, I think, a lot of potential work to be done. And also I think it's potentially powerful because it's not necessarily direct infusions of cash, right? So it's maybe, if we think there's some amount of, constraint on the total amount of, spending that can be done, this is something that doesn't actually require any direct investments. And I came to this certainly through antitrust, but it also is other types of regulated industry, more broadly, sort of how we do it, how we regulate the economy, how we regulate particular industries. But so I think there's definitely, or I'm pretty partial to this idea that there's been a lot of discussion about the sort of changes in how we do antitrust policy, both that have occurred over the past few decades, and now I think people are sort of arguing maybe we want to go back to a stronger antitrust regime. And there's a lot of different rationales that people give or consequences that people talk about of the more lax enforcement that's happened recently. But I think one that is, I think, very intriguing to me is sort of the geographic consequences. And,
Yep.
you know, to some extent, this is a sort of relatively straightforward arithmetic story, right? Particularly if you're thinking about like location of corporate headquarters.
Yeah, like anchor employers. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, exactly. Like big employers, especially like the headquarters where they have, you know, a lot of the particularly high paying jobs, and also the just the like economic control of like, you know, are we going to close this factory or not? Like if that's being made by somebody who lives in your town, I think the decision might be taken sort of differently than if it's being made by somebody who's in, you know, some far off city or some other country or something like that. And so I think sort of being attentive to that and realizing that there might be geographic implications to corporate consolidation is something that really should be thought about. And then, you know, I think there's also another area where I think it's really interesting is like in regulation of transportation or of communications industries, where historically the federal government had like a very, like surprisingly, I think today, explicit policy priority of we're going to use our power as the government to knit this country together and to make, you know, to the extent possible, you can't be perfect, but to the extent possible, we're going to make it so that you can participate in the federal national economy, even if you live in a rural area, even if you live in Alaska, that sort of thing. And, you know, they did this through, you know, starting with the postal service, right? It's the same price to mail a letter, no matter where you're sending it in the country. And that's, you know, that's not a marginal cost pricing, right? That's a decision that we're going to, you know, we think it's important to have it be equally possible to participate in the mail, no matter where you live. And that was done also in transportation for a while. And we sort of backed off of that in transportation, certainly, especially in like air travel, and also in new forms of communication like broadband or cellular service. And so I think, you know, reconsidering sort of our regulation of those types of sectors in particular, along with antitrust more generally, is something that really should be thought about seriously.
You know, economic, social costs of movement. You can't just necessarily move people. Many of our highly productive cities have also become incredibly unaffordable. I think this actually dovetails nicely into the next panel that we're going to have that'll kind of, you know, dive into some of these issues more deeply. But I would just say for now, Robert Manduca, thank you, University of Michigan. Check his work out. It's fantastic. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Robert.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Bradley and Robert, for just a wonderful conversation. My name is Catherine Zekier. I'm a labor market policy analyst with the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. And I'm really excited to have, I'll be moderating our great panel of policy experts today to discuss what this research means for national, state, and local policy. And for our audience, I'll also note that we'll have a time for audience questions and for our panelists at the very end. So that will be a time to ask questions of our panelists, and also Robert Manduca, in about 45 minutes. So you'll be able to submit your questions using the Q&A box, excuse me, at the bottom of your screen in Zoom, or in comments on the YouTube page if you're watching on the live stream. So I'm joined here today by Olugbenga Ajilore, Senior Advisor at the Office of Undersecretary for Rural Development at the USDA, Dominique Derbigny, Senior Vice President of the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, and Whitney Tucker, Deputy Director at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities State Fiscal Research Team. So there's a lot of what we can discuss today. Since we're talking about regional inequality, and I mean, these regions encompass very diverse communities, economies, especially because conversations about place and policy making tend to focus on cities, I'd like to step back for a minute and talk about rural areas. So Olugbenga, I'd love to start with you, but also ask our other panelists to jump in on this. We often hear a lot about stories about how there's been the decline of agriculture and manufacturing and mining and how that has affected rural communities. But to what extent, like, are those trends affecting communities? Do those industries define all of rural communities? Like, how should we think about rural economies and the people who live there?
Thank you very much for that question, Catherine, and thank you to Equitable Growth for inviting me to this panel. I'm really excited to talk about this because a lot of my work here at Rural Development and in my previous work has focused on regional inequality. And I think the first thing to think about this is that this focus on regional inequality is important because we have this inequality because we don't think places are worthy of investment. And so we have to start from a place where the places are worthy of investment, and more importantly, the people in those places are worthy of investment. And so once we start from there, then we can start thinking about the policies. And what I really appreciate about Robert's work is the discussion of place-conscious policies. And so that place-conscious comes in play because rural areas, as you mentioned, are not a monolith. It's not all farms and low density places, but it's just places that are smaller towns in terms of population. And so one of the important things to think about in terms of policy and issues is to understand the diversity of rural areas. And so one of the things that Bradley and Robert have talked about in their fireside chat was this interaction between race and space. And so one of the things that we miss about rural areas is diversity. And so there's the racial and ethnic diversity, but there's also economic diversity in terms of industrial sector. So we talk about agriculture, there's manufacturing, there's mining, but there's also technology, there's innovation. There's also the service sector is a huge, plays a huge role in that. And actually goes into part of the conversation about corporate consolidation, market consolidation, that you have a lot of these firms that are the only employers in these places, and then they impact these service sector workers. So I think to understand regional inequality, to understand how we should think about these issues, the first thing we need to think about is that these places and the people in these places are worthy of investment.
I think that's a really good point. Just want to add to that, this really ties into the historical context here when we're talking about place-based inequality, because regional disparities, as Dr. Manduca really noted in his essay, are both a driver and a consequence of racial inequality in our country. So even in 1980, when there was this sort of baseline economic equality that the country was experiencing, there were exceptions in the rural South, in the Rio Grande Valley, in other areas that have really long been identified as places where we see persistent rural poverty, and also areas that are predominantly inhabited by people of color. And so I think that as we talk about investments that need to be made to ensure that there is economic equality across rural areas, we also have to talk about this idea that was just brought up about the people in those places being worth investment, and how we affirm the value of all people in a way that this country just historically has not.
Yes, thanks for this question, Catherine, and thank you both, Whitney and Benga, for your insights on this already. I would also just echo, I'm here in Georgia, in Atlanta, in the South, in the Black Belt, and oftentimes, you'll hear people use the term rural, and it's really kind of a code for white, but recognizing that many rural areas are made up largely of people of color, especially here in the Black Belt, and we have very large populations of Black and Brown people here. My father is from Gramercy, Louisiana. Most of my family is from the Black Belt. And so, they really grew up in the river parishes, which is also known as Cancer Alley, due to the high prevalence of cancer due to the chemical and sugar refineries there. This was also one of the few places that Black people could purchase homes in the 60s. And so there's so many, there's so much history, I think, to Whitney's point about why there are sort of these regional and racial disparities, recognizing that after, slavery and Jim Crow, Black people were, continued to be thwarted in terms of economic advancement and opportunity. There were policies that limited job opportunities, land ownership, where people could live. Of course, Jim Crow and segregation also further restricted those liberties. And so we continue to see sort of that wrapped up in the patterns of who lives where and why. And that's also directly tied, the racial injustice, economic injustice, and then the climate injustice that we're seeing is all directly connected together. And so I think it's just really important that we note that and make sure that that's part of the conversation.
Right, just before we move on, that also just reminded me of the fact that it was mentioned in the essay, but that a lot of places in the South in particular started making more investments in the public good after the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, because there was electoral pressure largely from Black voters. And I think that as we're talking about all of these improvements that need to be made to people's lives, and also improvements like, climate justice issues, right, that are for all of us, that if we are allowing our political systems to be stifled by partisan voter suppression, gerrymandering today, that those things are also going to have an impact on our economic well-being, because we're not going to see that boost in the economy of the entire region that was seen sort of directly after the Voting Rights Act was passed, right? When we start seeing people's votes matter and then being able to express the things that they want to see in their own communities.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you all. And I would love to dive into this more and talk more about the roots of regional inequality and its intersection with racial inequality, with these racist policy decisions and some of these other factors, both historical and present. So we talked a little bit about some of these, but what are some of the other major historical trends, federal policy decisions that you think are important for understanding income inequality, especially inequality by race, when thinking about racial inequality?
Sure, I'll start. Just say that I think that place-based policymaking has really just taken over in the vacuum that was left from federal leadership pulling out in the form of antitrust enforcement, industry regulation, the stuff that we heard about in that fireside chat. And so that has really exacerbated racial inequalities by region, because it has created an economic system that's really just less efficient, because it's funneling resources away from the systems that cause inequalities and toward local areas that are negatively impacted by those systems. So even in the places where we have correctly identified that there is a high level of need, which is debatably not all of the places that we should, right? Which is something we could get into with things like opportunity zones, right? But the incredibly high level of need just persists despite the investment in those areas, because we aren't addressing the structural cause, which is, the antitrust enforcement, the industry regulation, the stuff that makes it possible for people to have more choice in the economic system about where they live and why they live there. If we are not making those investments at the federal level that change the landscape, then people are going to continue to be driven into the same regions, the same sorts of jobs, the same sorts of wages, and that is going to just sort of self-perpetuate.
I think one way to think about this is that in Robert's piece, he talks about place-conscious policy. So these are national federal policies that have impact by place. And so I think when I hear this question, I think about federal policy from like the 30s to the 50s. And you think about how these were national policies. So I think about the New Deal, the Fair Labor Standards Act, where that was a national policy, but because of the exceptions and who was left out, that had an impact on who's going to benefit. And so then from that, we see the kind of the long tail structural racism that impacts us today when you think about the minimum wage debate. I think about, infrastructure is a big topic right now, and there was a huge infrastructure policy that had huge regional implications. We think about the highway system and where it was built and what places it built through. And you think about the people who lost their homes there and what the values of those homes would be today. And that's the loss there. And again, we think about lower average incomes in these, actually within metro areas, because a lot of it, that federal policy. And so there's all these policies that we've had that have had race implications and place implications that impact us today in 2021. And so that is kind of like that driver of this regional inequality.
Being here in Georgia, I think a couple other things that come to mind are just thinking about like mass incarceration, which due to racism and laws and policing largely affects Black people, but also Native American and Latinx people. Even though there's been some reform that's happened in Georgia, we remain the #1 state for people who are under correctional control. That's largely due to probation. And people who are incarcerated, we all know, are really largely left out of economic opportunity, challenges with accessing jobs, housing, resources and supports, and then facing the continued sort of discrimination and prejudice in hiring, being ostracized by community, making it even more challenging to gain that economic success afterwards during re-entry. Also thinking about education here in Georgia, Georgia's Black Belt is really the area of land where slave labor was highly concentrated, in the K through 12 school districts in the Black Belt have smaller enrollments, higher proportions of Black students, and higher rates of poverty. And the pandemic, made even clearer how under-resourced those areas are, especially as things shifted to online learning. 8.2% of the state has no viable option to take part in online instruction at home. And counties with smaller school districts have much lower rates of broadband access than medium and large district counterparts. And those happen to be counties, again, within that Black belt. So largely, this is going to continue to exacerbate inequities in education for Black and Brown students.
No, absolutely. And also, so at the same time, I also want to ask, what are some examples of how federal policies, what are there federal policies or trends in federal spending, whether tax policy, labor policy, social policies, or others, what are some examples of these universal federal policies that may have reduced income inequality or racial inequality? Like we'll definitely talk more about what some of the challenges are and what hasn't worked. I also want to ask, like, what has worked? What have we seen work? What does the evidence show?
Sure. So this was sort of brought up in the fireside chat, but universal anti-poverty programs, I think, are a really important piece of this place-conscious shift that the country needs, because the benefits that they provide help to address those racial injustices that we're talking about, but they are also providing impacts that people can see immediately. And so one of the things that comes to mind for me right now is the recent temporary expansion to the child tax credit. Right? So the expansion to that credit that is in President Biden's American Families Plan would deliver really incredible additional income to low-income children and their families. But it makes that full credit available to about 27 million kids in families that didn't qualify for it prior to the American Rescue Plan because their families didn't make enough money, right? Or had earnings that were just too low each year. So that number, that 27 million, includes roughly half of all the Black children and half of all Latinx children in our country. Right. So if we are to make a change like that permanent, then that is a place-conscious change that is universally applied, but will have an impact specifically on Black and Latinx children from low-income households, who we know are more likely to be concentrated in those high poverty areas of our state, like the South, like the Rio Grande Valley. Like right now, I think it was the latest figure that I have at the top of my mind is from 2019, I think, but it's like 56% of Black people in our country live in the South, right? And so if you put in place a policy like this that has a significant impact on the lowest earners amongst a group of people who are primarily concentrated in the South, those impacts are gonna be felt all over the country, because that's gonna give more people freedom to maybe take on higher paying jobs over time, to have a little bit more income to save, to be able to possibly move somewhere else, right? And so over time, we might actually see less regionalization if we continue to put in place those large scale sort of programs that are targeting the people who have the highest need right now.
So here in Georgia, again, I think there's a lot of potential for universal programs to really support economic justice and economic opportunity for people here. I mean, we're a state with preemption laws, and our state minimum wage remains at $5.15 an hour. So there are still some exceptions in which people can be paid less than the federal minimum wage, which we already know is also inadequate to meet people's basic needs. So raising the federal minimum wage could have some really significant implications for workers in Georgia. It would also help to address racial inequities, given that women of color and other people of color are overrepresented in jobs that pay low wages. But I think we've also just seen that there have been some limitations when it comes to universal programs as well. Bradley and Robert talked earlier about the federal unemployment insurance, the additional benefits that have been provided during the pandemic and recession. But Georgia, and we had an estimated 347,000 Georgians benefit from those additional funds until the state just stopped administering them recently. So we're one of those states where now we've decided not to continue to provide that benefit. And that's why you need federal legislation that, includes a floor for state-run UI programs, a minimum number of weeks and a benefit amount that's ongoing. Also, we've seen limitations with this with regards to TANF. So Georgia does not maximize the benefits of TANF. Instead, we use the block grant to direct shares of TANF funds away from direct cash assistance in order to offset tax and budget cuts. In fiscal year 2021, just 12% of TANF funding spent was on basic cash assistance. We also provide extremely low amounts of cash assistance that are not sufficient for any family to meet their basic needs. So Georgia's maximum benefit is $280 per month for a family of 3, which is well below what it takes to bring a family above the poverty line, which would be about $1,800 per month. And this has remained unchanged since the 90s. We also continue to enforce some of the most restrictive benefit rules in the nation that make TANF inaccessible for most families in deep poverty. So the family cap, if the TANF recipient becomes pregnant while receiving benefits, they cannot receive additional benefits for the new child. There's extensive work reporting requirements. And both of these things are just rooted in racist stereotypes, right? The welfare queen trope, the assumption that it's all Black women who are on welfare, who are unwed and just having multiple children and living off of the system. And then also this assumption around laziness, which again is rooted in slavery, this assumption that Black people won't work if, on their own accord, so you just have to force them to work. And so this is why, as important as federal policies can be, I think continuing to build political will and advocating for change at the state level remains important, because of the implementation of those policies still often falls on states.
And I'd like to pick up on Dominique's point. There are 2 points that she made. One about a floor. I think one of the best things to do is, in all policies, raising the floor. So part of that's like the federal minimum wage. If you look last year during the CARES Act, where we had those stimulus payments, it's like anything that lifts the floor is going to help people, not just by race, but by region too. And so, because a lot of times a lot of people will make the argument that rural areas shouldn't get as much benefit because they have a lower cost. Well, they have a lower cost because of a racist history of labor policy. And so it's when you go into that, you're kind of buying into that narrative. And so one of the biggest things you do is raise the floor. Another very important point that doesn't get a lot of talk is state preemption of local ordinances. And so we saw this a lot in the minimum wage debate, but this is also in the broadband debate, which is another thing that would have benefits by race, and especially by race, because again, we saw through the pandemic when everyone had to work from home, go to school from home, and Dominique had mentioned that there's a lot of places that just couldn't do that. There was a number of stories that just broke my heart, where school district superintendents would get school buses, equip them with a hotspot, and drive it to different places in the community so that people could not only just go to school, but then apply for jobs, or apply for unemployment insurance, things like that you have to do online. And so, having universal broadband and being able to give like the flexibility of local areas to, either do cooperative development or other places to be able to get them to have broadband. But in a number of states, I think it's about 18 or 19 states, they preempt local areas from being able to kind of provide their own broadband. And so tackling those kind of things are going to have, it's a universal policy that would have regional place conscious, impacts, positive impacts for people.
Yeah, and no, thank you everyone. And that's such an important point while we're talking about this interplay between local, state, and national policy. As Dominique mentioned, about state administration programs affecting the impact of these policies, and both Dominique and Benga talking about preemption. The state preempts local policies that also have like national, so where national solutions might be able to address that. There's just a lot of ways that seemingly straightforward universal programs don't really have the impact we expect they do once they're actually applied and once they actually sort of make it through the different levels. So are there any other examples around preemption or state administration that we should be talking about? I'm especially thinking of anything that's really come through, as Whitney mentioned, with the impacts of the pandemic, because I feel like we've had some really good examples of big, fast, broad-based federal programs that then have different impacts. And and maybe aren't having the impacts we would want them to have addressing inequality when they actually reach the state level.
Go ahead, Binga.
I was going to bring up someone in the chat or the Q&A had brought up right to work laws and bans on public sector unions. And so one of the things that we see, people always talk about like how great, income was, and during the 50s and median income was more even, there was less inequality, but that was also the high point for unionization. And so anything that strengthens collective bargaining rights, that boosts worker power, those are the kind of things that would minimize regional inequality. And so it's one of those things where you look at the right to work states and you see where the first ones came up in the 40s and 50s, these were all in the South. And it was not, that was not random. And then, as the time passed, it got through the Midwest and places like that. And then that kind of ties into the discussion earlier about antitrust, corporate consolidation, labor market concentration, things like that. And as we see workers are getting less and less power, we're seeing an increase in that inequality. So any sort of policies that would strengthen collective bargaining rights and worker power is going to have positive impacts regionally.
I think I'll just add to that, the expansion of public sector unions, I think is really important when we're talking about discrimination, not only by race, but by gender. We know from the evidence that we already have that women and people of color tend to benefit the most from their involvement in public sector unions, because there is so much discrimination in the labor and employment markets already that is preventing them from having high wage jobs that allow for more earnings over time, more savings, and that those are really a way that we can fight that sort of longstanding discrimination in our system. But right now we are seeing in many states small tweaks, right, year to year to the plans, the public sector pension plans. We're seeing that they're trying to exclude more people from joining those plans. We're seeing that they're trying to change the benefit amounts. And I think that to Dominique's point about local advocacy being really important at the state level, even if we did have some more federal intervention here, that it is really important that local advocates continue to look at programs like that, because those small changes year to year end up cutting out more of the people who need those benefits the most over time. And so that we end up with our largest public sector unions being things like police unions, right? And then people like teachers being left out.
Yes, both really great points. The other thing that's coming to mind for me, again, in Georgia is, we received $4.7 billion in flexible funding through the American Rescue Plan Act, and there's still not clarity around exactly how those funds will be spent. We've been doing, some advocacy with our federal lawmakers around, again, how to use those dollars, and we're really hoping that we will put that money towards equitable investments that target those who have been the most impacted by the pandemic. One of the things that we've pushed for a long time is a Georgia work credit or a Georgia state earned income tax credit. We don't currently have that in place the way some other states do. And so there's an opportunity here for us to create, a Georgia work credit that is provided as direct payments modeled after, the direct cash payments that have been made in response to the pandemic. And so we also want to see, budget cuts restored, additional funding for schools, especially schools serving students that live in poverty, additional funding for mental health supports, and things of that nature. So, there's a real opportunity here to, to have this federal investment, to have this funding to help us with an equitable recovery, but it's really important that those funds are actually designated in an equitable way.
And no, absolutely. And the next thing I want to ask about is, we've in the fireside chat, Robert and Bradley talked a little bit about this, and I know we've mentioned it here, but opportunity zones, as an example of targeted tax breaks. What were some of the promises of opportunity zones? What do they mean to do? And what does the evidence show us about what this type of approach can do to address geographic inequality?
Sure. So I think that the general promise of opportunity zones was that they would create a new tax break that would encourage investment in low income areas. right? So areas where they could increase opportunity. I think that the problem that we have seen with opportunity zones is that really they have become sort of a tax haven for real estate investors in particular, who raise profit from this tax break at the federal level, and then also in many cases at the state level, again, right? Because states are not decoupling from federal opportunity zone tax breaks. And they're able to accumulate more wealth that doesn't have any sort of requirements to ensure that local residents actually benefit from their investments that receive the tax break. So this tax break essentially can amount to a subsidy for gentrification, right, in a lot of areas, instead of providing housing and jobs for low-income communities. I think that what is really important to keep in mind here is that it was an effort, right, to ostensibly help local communities, but that it is always possible that we could just invest those funds directly into local governments, right? Like that was always an option. And instead, we chose tax breaks for folks who had unrealized capital gains, right? So I think that when we look at federal investments into areas of low opportunity, right, if we want to call it that, though honestly, I don't even think that that is fair, because I think that every place has a similar level of opportunity if we have the will to invest in it. We know that that money could have been better invested directly into families through things like possibly universal basic income, right? But instead, we have created these hyper-localized investment areas, and those aren't going to, my original point, fix the underlying issue that caused high poverty, that caused stagnant wages, that caused poor education in schools in those areas to begin with, right? That doesn't address any of the systemic issues that led to those problems. And so over time, we are allowing people to put their money into these areas and to really get a lot of personal input in a way that the public is not able to draw back out from.
I'm going to use this moment to plug the agency I work for, because one of the things, as I mentioned before, is that we need to have investment in these places and in the people in these places. And there's a ton of federal government programs all across, not just USDA, but Department of Commerce, Department of Labor, have all these programs, but it's difficult to apply for these programs, whether they're grants, loans, or things like that. So investing in communities means investing in the capacity for these communities to be able to use these things. And one of the problems with the opportunity zones is that doesn't quite invest in the people or the places. It provides the tax breaks to people who are already wealthy, who have already benefited from pre-existing investments that they've already had. And so one of the best ways to, actually helping, distressed communities that have been left behind is to actually focus the resources towards the people in the communities and help them to be able to take advantage of federal programs, take advantage of philanthropic foundations, take advantage of all these resources. But instead of giving it to people to go to a place, have the money go to the people in those places, build up their capacity for applying for these grants, for doing these things. And then that's what's going to help reverse it. And then the other problem with opportunity zones, and this is actually a general problem with focusing on tax credits, is that it's indirect and it's giving an incentive to people to engage in behavior that you would hope they would engage in. But if people were going to do these things, they would have done it already. And so that's why you got to focus on the people who are already in these communities, who are already invested in these communities, and then just build up the capacity to be able to take advantage of that. And these programs don't do that.
Thank you. And this also, I also want to jump to another question that's related. Because when we talk about the place in policymaking, when we talk about place-based approaches, when we talk about, even like innovation economy, things like this. As we've discussed previously, like we really focus on cities and also a particular set of cities sometimes. And I think some people in the audience might be wondering, maybe an unspoken question here is, displaced conscious policy just mean investing in cities? And we've covered that a little bit. It also leads to the question, like, why don't people just move? Why don't we just tell people to move to places? that if their region isn't doing well, if their area isn't doing well, why don't they just move?
Well, simple answer is that the places that you want to move to, just look at the house prices. Look at what rent, the cost of living. The other thing is, okay, fine, if you move to a place, what kind of jobs are there? Are there high income jobs or are there low wage jobs? If they're low wage jobs, can you live in a place that would help you commute? Because then there's these stories of people having to move, like the inner core is becoming more expensive. So you have to move farther out. But if you don't have a car, you take public transit. How efficient is public transit for you to get it? So people are commuting hour and a half, 2 hours to these low wage jobs. And then you think about food and other things like that. So part of it is, it's costly to be able to do that. And plus the urban rural wage premium is no longer there. But I actually take issue with this question is that we should value all the places in this country. That we can't look at a place as this is not a good place, because people have value in these places. Now, a number of us have moved and, like other places, but a lot of people like to stay. And that's a good thing. And there's nothing wrong with that. And, we need to invest in these places, but more importantly, we need to value all these places. And so if there's things that we can do, because there are things that we can do to help build these communities back up, then we should do that.
I think there's also the problem that fiscal federalism just generally increases economic distortion. So people start making their choices based on the tax situation in a certain place, based on the housing market in that place, based on the school system in that place, which is largely funded by the local tax base, right? And so a lot of these things change depending on who lives in each area. And as we continue to invest in these hyper-localized areas and consider some entire swaths of the country is just sort of beyond assistance, right? And we write off those places and all of those people, then what's going to happen is that maybe everybody would move into these city centers, right? But if they did, to Benga's point, everybody wouldn't be able to afford to stay there. Everybody wouldn't be able to afford to stay there in conditions that are optimal for not only themselves, but also for their families, right? So we wouldn't see people, over time having the sort of quality of life that I think we really value ourselves for having in this country. And we really tout as sort of the American dream, that wouldn't exist anymore, because the way that our society works right now is that centralized funding is really what we rely on to promote equality, because then all areas can receive a similar level of resources, and that would promote choice and therefore just efficiency in our economic market. So people could live where they wanted to without considering things like that relative tax burden of another place. And so reforming the way that we finance public goods and moving away from this city-centric or even state-centric model really shifts us away from an over-reliance on state and municipal support that allows people to have more opportunity and more choice, right? And we want people to feel like they can live anywhere in the country and still have a reasonable quality of life. Also, I think that it's worth noting, to Benga's point, that recent research has really backed up this idea that there is a really interesting link between the sort of slowing population growth in rich cities and then the slowing regional income convergence. So less skilled workers really used to move to rich states to increase their wages. But that lowered the average income in the rich states while raising it in poor ones, because people's natural tendency to move toward what they saw as economic opportunity helped to drive the nationwide convergence of wages and incomes. But right now, in the way that we live today, local zoning restrictions in most states really prevent adequate levels of house building for the working population. So the higher incomes that are earned in rich states just sort of clawed back in the form of higher housing costs. And so with workers with high incomes, that trade-off is really worth it. But for those with lower incomes, it generally isn't, and they have to move out. So they've begun moving out of rich states and rich cities toward cheaper ones, which is throwing off the pattern of wage and income convergence in our country into reverse. And I think just building upon this shift that we've had in political ideology since about the Reagan era about how much we want the government to interfere or to provide to states.
I want to go back to what you said, Benga, about the question itself, because I agree. I think the question is a little bit problematic. It comes from such a place of privilege, right? To just say to people, why don't you just move? And I hear this question all the time. My family, as I mentioned, is from, largely from the Black Belt of the South, and specifically the Gulf Coast area where there are hurricanes. And you hear people say that too. Well, why do people just live in places where there are hurricanes? Why don't they just move? Or why do people live in places where there's earthquakes or wildfires or, any kind of, why don't they just move? And I think it's just the wrong question. I think it's, why have people been, well, first of all, I think it's recognizing that people's lives are often tied to their communities. There's history there, there's ancestry there, there's lineage. It's so asking someone to just uproot their whole community, their whole history, just to pursue something different. I think that, again, that's very dismissive of a person's lived experience. I also think that, again, to Benga's point, how expensive it is to move. I mean, we all know how expensive it is to move, whether you're renting or buying a house or whatever. Like, the cost of getting first and last month's rent and security deposit, the cost of a moving truck, having to, find a new job, leave your place of employment, like just these assumptions that it's such an easy process for someone to move and that it's something that everybody can afford to do. It's a very expensive thing to do. And a lot of people don't want to leave their homes. They don't want to leave the land that they're from. They don't want to leave the place where they grew up, where the rest of their family is situated. Just to go and be in a place where they're isolated and where they don't have that same sense of community. We saw a lot of that even with the Great Migration. Lots of people did move. People up and left the South and moved to the Midwest and moved to the Northeast and other parts of the country. And they were met with hatred and people burning down their homes and communities and running them out. I mean, so I just think there's a lot to unpack in that question. And just like, why do we assume that the solution is just that we relocate people out of their place, as opposed to why do we not assume that actually targeted investments in place are important? We've been talking about this as like sort of this either or, it's place conscious or it's place based. And I think it's a both and honestly, I think it's really about anti-racist policies. Like, all of this needs to be about, are these policies actually supporting and sustaining equity or inequity? Because you can have universal policies that still sustain racial inequity, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually getting to the desired future state, that we want. Like, we want an economy and a society where everybody can thrive and everybody can reach their full potential, regardless of where they live or who they are or what they look like. And we're not going to get to that unless we have both targeted interventions and universal proactive policy solutions.
I wanted to pick up on Dominique's point about anti-racist policy. And there was a question in the Q&A asking about the statement I made earlier about the lower cost of living in rural areas as a product of racist, like a racist history of labor policy and also public finance. And what I was talking about is that in the during the Jim Crow era, there was a move to try to attract firms from the North, industrial firms, to the South. And so what they did was to say, that's when we started seeing the right to work policies and the lack of collective bargaining rights, where you would have a low wage labor force that wouldn't unionize. And so that would attract firms in. So now, if you have a low wage labor force, that means you have a low tax base. Because the other thing that went along with that is you move down from the North to the South, we will have property tax abatements, things to lower the, quote unquote, business costs. So what that does is it depletes the tax base for those communities. When you deplete the tax base, that means you can't put in public services. And so, as Dominique mentioned, you have all these places, and this is where, you have the intersection of racial and climate justice, where I have a lot of these industrial firms were polluting and put in these communities that affected communities of color. And so over time, you have this erosion of the tax base. And then what happens is that those firms then move from the South overseas as kind of a race to the bottom. So now you eroded your tax base, but there's no firms, there's no CEOs living in the communities, all the CEOs. And so you're left with a place with no tax base, a low wage workforce, and therefore no spending on education, public services, things like that. So what you have, now the thing is, a part of that, push was racist policies in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, but it didn't stop with Black people or brown people. It affected everybody in the community. And so when you have anti-racist policies, the benefit, it does not stop with Black people or brown people. It benefits everybody. You look at some of the things with low wages or wage theft, things like that. That affects the whole community because now people aren't able to spend as much, not able to put money back into the community. So when we push for anti-racist policies, the benefits of that is going to spill over throughout. And then you have upward mobility, then you have increased social mobility. And then it goes back to Robert's point about social cohesion and polarization. And so, kind of tying everything together is that the push for anti-racist policies, the push to think more about place, both place conscious and place based, is about uplifting the economy as a whole, locally, statewide, nationally.
Great, thank you. And I'm just going to be mindful of time because we're moving on to our Q&A portion in a minute. But first question I'm going to ask everyone is to respond to sort of anything else that we've discussed today, either in the fireside chat or in the panel that you want to discuss. And maybe something that we could start out with is I'd like to talk more about what anti-racist policies, what we would like to see there, especially given this interplay between regional inequality, different levels of government, so all those factors that we've talked about today. But just to start out, a quick note for the audience, we're now moving to the Q&A portion, so you can ask questions through Zoom in the Q&A box. We already have some there, or through YouTube live stream. We'll bring those in as well. And just, if you can, please give your first and last name along with your institution or workplace, but especially if your question is directed at a particular person, please indicate that as well. So yeah, I think we're going to bring Robert back. And unfortunately, Bradley Hardy was not able to stay with us for the Q&A. Yeah, starting out, is there anything anyone wants to respond to that we've discussed previously? Robert, since you're coming back joining us, is there anything that you wanted to respond to or build on that we've discussed so far?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I'll be mindful of time, but just I really appreciate all the panelists, taking the time to engage with this paper and also bring your own expertise to bear on these questions. I found the panel really exciting and energizing. I think I would just echo a couple of the things that came up. I really like the framing around, places are worthy of investment and the people in them are worthy of investment, and that's true everywhere. And I think that, that's a big shift from how these sorts of topics have been talked about, I think, in the recently of the logic has been sort of places have to prove that they're worthy of investment and make themselves competitive for investment and earn the investment. And I think that shifting to it, every place is worthy, and you shouldn't have to uproot yourself from your community in order to trade that off against a economic opportunity, I think is really helpful. And additionally, the way that I think Whitney was talking about it, about sort of the need to fix the underlying structural problems and not try to kind of paper them over with things after the fact or policies to address things after the fact, I think is really well put. And then, just as I think all the panelists brought out, the importance of being extremely vigilant about the potential for carve-outs or, implementation gaps or that sort of thing to really undercut the promise or the potential of universal programs, and, be aware that that has historically happened and it's historically been, very frequently racially targeted, and that really, perpetuates racial inequality while also limiting the effects of the policy that were, hypothesized or hoped for overall. And so I think, as we're thinking about new policies, we should be really mindful of ways to prevent that sort of carving out, either in the policy itself, like with the Fair Labor Standard Acts, or in the implementation, I think will be really important.
Great, thank you, Robert. And yeah, does any of the panelists want to respond to that, or to our previous conversations about anti-racist policies and what that could look like, especially in addressing regional inequality?
So there's so many things, right? I think that one example that's come up a lot as we've been talking at the center about the response to the pandemic is the creation of subsidized jobs. So this is something that is really proven to advance racial equity, to boost economic recoveries. We know that higher unemployment in recessions widens racial gaps because, again, of discrimination that's in the labor market that's already baked in to who is, the first fired, the last hired, who is more likely to be rehired after losing a position. And we know that that is less likely to be people of color, right? And so that worsens racial inequality, that hurts the economy as a whole. But subsidized employment can dramatically improve people's employment and wages. And in some of the programs in states, they saw that there were employment outcomes that lingered long after the subsidization ended, right? And so the TANF Emergency Fund that had 260,000 subsidized jobs in the recovery from the Great Recession showed that if you, adequately at the federal level and with flexibility at the state level, scale up programs like this, that you can really respond appropriately to an economic downturn in a way that is specifically targeting an issue of racial inequality in your area, while also giving people an opportunity that we can't force right now in terms of social ideals to get people back into the sorts of jobs with the sorts of wages that they need. But we can use federal funds and state flexibilities to create subsidized jobs that help people to get back on their feet. I think also, just before we move on, I also just want to lift up just unrestricted cash payments, right? This is something that has a really strong racialized impact, partly because of the history, right? A lot of the arguments that we see today are informed, to a point that Dominique made earlier, I think, about the UI system that we currently have, by really racist tropes about who is deserving and undeserving and who wants to work and who doesn't, right? And so when we talk about unrestricted cash payments, this is a way that we can be directly putting money into the hands of people who need it and fighting back against the discrimination that they have already encountered in our employment markets. And also saying to that history that we acknowledge that there has been this prevailing ideal that has been spouted again and again, that you can't just give money to people, especially to non-white people, because they don't know what to do with it, they don't want to work, they just want to take this money from the federal government. But that's just not true, right? And that we have seen that proven over and over again with programs like the EITC, like the child tax credit, and that unrestricted cash payments are a way to immediately boost the economy and also to push back against the racist impacts of a lot of our federal and state tax policies.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you mentioned that, Whitney, because the guaranteed income piece, there are pilots that are happening in different parts of the country that are targeted. There's even one that we're working on here in Atlanta, in the Old Fourth Ward, that is targeting Black mothers in a certain community that has, again, historically been, disinvested in terms of supporting for Black and Brown people in that community. We've seen it with the Magnolia's Mothers Trust in Jackson, Mississippi, which is a similar pilot program that they've done, where they've also followed up and done research on how this has improved economic security and well-being for the families participating in the program. And they've seen so many positive benefits of people being able to, get better paying jobs, save money, go, do things for their children and families, take a vacation, just all the things that they would never be able to do. And so, yeah, I think, we do have a very kind of paternalistic approach often with programs, in assuming that people don't know what to do with their money, or that we know what people need. And, and I think unrestricted cash is certainly an opportunity here. And I think it's important to distinguish that between UBI, or universal basic income, and like more of guaranteed income or specific programs that are more targeted. UBI, giving every single family in the country the same amount of money won't do anything when it comes to inequity in income and wealth. And so I think that that's important to note. There are programs that have been put forth that they have done research on that would actually help to close the racial wealth gap, where white households have about 10 times the wealth of Black households in this country. And again, that's due to a legacy of policies that have favored white, wealthy, cis hetero men. So even though we've had policies that we have said are race neutral, those policies actually have not been race neutral. They have favored and benefited white people and specifically white men. And so when we ask for anti-racist policies and policies that actually are, designed to benefit everyone and specifically Black and brown people, and, to Benga's point, that actually benefits everyone in the long run. If you design a program that is to benefit somebody who's been the most marginalized, maybe a Black transgender person with a disability, right? People who typically get left out of all of the benefits and all of the supports, or, undocumented person, again, LGBTQ with a disability, right? If you really look at the communities that have been the most marginalized and you make sure that you create policies that benefit them, it'll benefit everyone. It's very similar to the way that we are all suffering due to tipped wages, which was rooted in, again, slavery and in not wanting to pay Black people for their labor post-slavery. And now everybody suffers as a result of that. And that's a big issue that we've seen as a result also of the pandemic, because the hospitality industry was hit hard, restaurant industry was hit hard. And folks are now saying, oh, there's a labor shortage, people don't want to go back to work. It's like, no, people need living wages. People want to go to work to jobs that pay. And so we're still seeing the ripple effects of that. So I think it's just recognizing that, like, when we say anti-racist, like, I think sometimes people are like, oh, can't talk about race, or if we talk about racism, then you're just, you're alienating people, or you're leaving people out. And it's like, but all of our history of policies have specifically targeted certain groups and left other groups out. And so what we have to do something to rectify that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I want to pull out the thread. You mentioned wealth, and we've mostly talked about income so far. So I want to pull out that thread about wealth. One of the questions in the Q&A is asking about regulation study of commercial leases and about small business ownership, which it connects to this somewhat because there's another question about, I'm having trouble finding it, but about the role of wealth creation and how we can shift to talking about not just income, but also wealth and intergenerational wealth and the stability that provides. So what are some policies, in the conscious conversation that can also generate wealth creation or stability or growth and address, especially because so many of the racist past and present policies have to attack wealth and deplete wealth. There were several questions in there, but home ownership might be one place to start. But Dominique, go ahead.
So there has been a lot of research done about what kind of policies will or won't actually close the racial wealth divide. I know Whitney mentioned a bit about subsidized jobs or federal jobs guarantees. There's been a lot of research there. There's also been research on things like baby bonds. So, federally endowed trust accounts for all children born at birth, but that have different benefits depending on household income and wealth to kind of help close that gap. And there's been research done to show how that gap would close if policies like that were implemented. So I think that we know that there's lots of research and there's strategies that have been done. And I saw in the chat also a question about how do we move beyond just sort of individual or household wealth, but also community wealth with regards to these policies. And, I think Benga mentioned earlier a bit about sort of cooperative economics, but I think there are other opportunities to better invest in and support, things like community land trusts and, other cooperative economics projects. There's some stuff happening here in Atlanta where they've been able to, create, worker-owned businesses that, again, allows everybody to kind of benefit that's engaged in that. We did a program with a community of practice, really looking at what would it take to support Black entrepreneurship in Atlanta in a way that would help to better build community wealth and what kind of investments would we need. So I think there are opportunities there. I think people are looking at that, but there's been just a lot of research done about kind of what will and won't close the gap. And I think the majority of the research has shown that there has to be targeted and racially specific policies in place that take into account wealth and income, not just income, but that wealth piece in order to actually close the gap.
Yeah, I think that, progressive taxation is a really important thing to talk about here if we're going to talk about reducing inequality and increasing just the inclusion of all people of all backgrounds in our in our tax system here, I think that right now what we have is that revenue raising policies in states are not often really well targeted to those who have the highest incomes, right? And so we are pulling money for our communities from the people in our communities who need it the most. And that if we were to change that, that would really have a significant impact on wealth accumulation across generations. Right now, so much wealth that has been accumulated through racist means in the past has gone untaxed from generation to generation, and it is just widening that gap every single year. If we were to, try to break up the concentration of this nation's wealth from the hands of the few very wealthy people who currently hold it and are overwhelmingly white, that we would see in a lot of areas a significant increase in the number of Black families, Latinx families, even Indigenous families who are seeing significant boosts to not only their own savings and ability to accumulate wealth and pass it on over generations, but also we would see really positive impacts on, the communities that everyone lives in, right? Because right now we are not able to pull in the benefits of that revenue from those high income earners.
I think the one thing I want to add is a program that's actually part of the American Rescue Plan Act for farmers of color, and that's debt relief. And so what this kind of ties into, and this is actually a point I want to bring up that Dominique made, but really want to reemphasize, is that we talk about anti-racist policy, we talk about targeted policy, but the history of federal, state, local policy has always been targeted, has always been racially motivated. It's just always focused on white and basically white men. And so the difference here is that we want these almost same policies, but available to everybody. But to do that, we have to focus on the people who are the most marginalized. So we can't think of policies being racially targeted as something new. We've always had it. It's just who are we focusing on? And so when we talk about wealth, one reason why we have this debt relief program is because of the racist behavior previously from the USDA in terms of not providing higher interest rates or unfair loan terms, so that it increased the debt for farmers of color as opposed to white farmers. And so that debt relief is kind of a reversal of that. But then on top of that, having programs to help build back wealth. And then it goes to the important point of community wealth, not just individual and household wealth, but also community wealth. But I think there has to be recognition of our history and the racism and discrimination. And that will help inform the kind of policies that we need to build wealth back up for the most marginalized.
Great. Yes, thank you. And I think we're unfortunately out of time, but that's a wonderful place to end. So before Kate comes on, thanks everyone. I just want to say thank you so much to all of our panelists and speakers today for your time today. And thank you for a really wonderful discussion.
So just echoing Catherine's thank you, I want to thank Robert Manduca, Bradley Hardy, Olugbenga Ajilore, Dominique Derbigny Sims, and Whitney Tucker for joining us today for this really insightful discussion on regional inequality. I'd also like to thank my Equitable Growth colleagues who helped put this event together, in particular Catherine Zekier, as well as our events manager, Natalie Antandi, and our communications assistant, Shonda Williams. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining us today. Please stay tuned for our upcoming events, including our biennial policy conference this coming September. We can't wait to have you join us again.